The following feature presentation is part of the Skywalking Network.
Welcome to Star Warsologies, the podcast about science and other academic fields of study seen in Star Wars. My name is Melissa Miller, and I'm a freelance science writer. I'm one of your hosts.
And I'm James Floyd. I freelance for Star Wars Insider magazine. And this episode, Star Warsologies, is going to chat about conflict resolution in Star Wars from the interpersonal to the galactic, because wars not make one great. Our guest experts today are Jen Reynolds and Noam Ebner. They are the editors of the 2022 book, Star Wars and Conflict Resolution. Jen is an associate dean and professor of law at the University of Oregon, and Noam is a professor of negotiation and conflict resolution at Creighton University. Welcome, guys.
Hello there.
Okay, well, first, I don't know that quote, James. What is wars not make one great? Sounds like a Yoda line.
Ooh.
It is a Yoda line from Empire Strikes Back. He's looking for a great warrior, and he's like, wars not make one great.
That was very, very nearly the subtitle of the book.
Okay, well, now that we've figured that out, what is the subtitle of your book? And then a little bit about what conflict resolution is in general and what it covers.
Well, the subtitle of our book, and we actually have another book coming out soon with a different subtitle, but the subtitle of our first book is There Are Alternatives to Fighting, which is an Obi-Wan Kenobi quote from A New Hope. The whole premise of our book is that there are other ways to resolve conflict than fighting it out. And Star Wars ends up being a really interesting place to illustrate that particular proposition, because it does seem like Star Wars would be all about wars, and it is a lot of fighting. But there are other things we can learn from Star Wars about conflict that are more, we would think of them as more consonant with what dispute resolution and conflict management look like.
Like aggressive negotiations.
Right.
And balanced with diplomatic solutions. Another reason that we love that quote, there are alternatives to fighting, for the book, is because it also hints at that we would all do just a little bit better if only we knew a little bit more about how, the different alternatives that we have in conflict. I mean, the quote is in this moment where Han Solo, that's no moon. Uh-oh, it's a Death Star. They're not going to take me alive, Han Solo says, and he's about to attack the Death Star. And Obi-Wan sort of puts his hand on his shoulder and says, you can't win, but there are alternatives to fighting. And Obi-Wan plays this role of, let me be for a moment like a voice of wisdom here who says, dude, you're not going to win that way. Here are some other things we can think about. And we play that role so often in other people's lives. Some of us do it professionally. Both Jen and I have practiced as mediators, helping people manage conflict better than their intuition was. And that's partly the role of this book, is sort of to be that little extra added bit of knowledge, little extra added bit of fluency of capacity in working with conflict.
Are you allowed to tell us about the second book?
Oh, absolutely. So our second book is going to come out pretty soon. It's going to be this spring. It will be before May the 4th. And it's going to be Star Wars and Conflict Resolution, My Negotiations Will Not Fail. A little more sinister quote.
It's also a very optimistic title when you take out the sinister part of it. Conflict resolution might be seen as the flip side of conflict, but another way to look at the flip side of conflict is negotiation. Negotiation is the process through which ultimately we work everything out. Think of any war that's ever been fought. In the end, it was fought on a field, and then it gets resolved and ended in a tent or at a table or in a room in which people talk about how to resolve the original issue that brought us to the battlefield, or just about what life is going to look like from now on. So when you hear someone like Emperor Palpatine saying something like, my negotiations will not fail, which is something that neither Jen or I, who've each been in this field for over 20 years, we can't say that about our negotiation.
How does it work kind of on that larger level when you have sides that don't agree and don't want to negotiate? Like Anakin points out that, someone should make them agree, someone wise. What happens like with the Senate or between the Separatists and the Republic?
One entry point into this is that, as we wrote in the first chapter of this new book, is that you get to say things like, my negotiations will not fail, when you're secretly pulling the strings of both sides in the negotiation. And so you can orchestrate it in a way that it will not fail, or that they will fail, which is actually what he was doing there. But in real life, in our own lives, we very rarely get to do that. And another entry point into that is that very often parties to a conflict feel that negotiation is an awful way to pursue resolution of this conflict. A big piece of the challenge in negotiation is simply getting people to the table. And then only once you've got them to the table, then you have your own problems. It reminds me of the scene in Rogue One where, how can we disperse the alliance? We've only just come together. Okay, now that we've come together, we can all argue with each other and, negotiate. And Jyn Erso doesn't stand a chance of that negotiation. But still, at least they showed up to the table.
And I'll add, it's a good question, James, and it's definitely one that comes up a lot when we talk to groups. How do you negotiate and resolve the giant conflict that's going on in Star Wars with all of the different pieces and all the different politics and all of the different interests, and it's shifting and changing all the time? And I think one of the challenges, and we see this in the Star Wars saga, is that a lot of the peace that they achieve has to be incrementally achieved. They don't just solve the problem and now it's all done. Even when the bad side tries to bring peace and, have absolute control of the universe, we know that that won't work either. So there's no kind of end point to the process of negotiating peace and resolving conflict. It's constant. And so I think that it's fluid and it's contingent. This is why Padme is such a great example of somebody who is, I'm glad you brought up that quote from her earlier, because I think that she has this sensibility of staying with it, keeping going, not losing hope, not losing heart.
There are several attempts to resolve the big problem with one big conversation, and that rarely works. And usually it's just a lot of hard work and difficult conversations. And that doesn't film very well, so a lot of
Right.
lightsabers. But I was thinking, as Jen was speaking, you talked about how Padme, she stayed in the game and she tried to solve small piece. But there was also that episode in the Clone Wars where she went to visit her separatist senator friend,
Bonteri.
Bonteri, right? And they worked together on how about if we just talked this over and resolved it, big picture. And it was sort of like an Anwar Sadat flying to Jerusalem to set in motion a Camp David peace accords mirror. And it also mirrored it in the same way, in the sense that someone on the sidelines or one of the string boys didn't like that happening and acted against that. So even though you have this peace process happening, there are always players on the side, and they're called spoilers in the jargon. And they're always working to undermine peace processes. Back to Jen and what she said about Padme. You brush the dust of geonosis off you and you get back in the game.
Right.
Interesting that you mention the incremental approach for negotiation. We also see the incremental approach kind of used against peace in giving the chancellor more and more powers. It's just like, we're going to vote just a little bit more power and then a little bit more. It's like, oh no, we're going to give him dictatorial powers, but just for this war. And then you take it a piece at a time. He's obviously kind of negotiating in his favor. And then we look at Padme in The Phantom Menace. She has her approach. There's she needs the Senate to act now. And at first she's allied with Chancellor Valorum, who's very amenable to working with her. And then she realizes that he's not the way to get there. And she just flips on him and says, vote of no confidence. We got to pick somebody else that will do something. And I'm sure that was quite a shock to him.
You mentioned both of you being, mediators in some part of your job. And I'm curious if you ever bring up Star Wars in that, just be like, you're acting a little Darth Vader. I need you to be a little bit more Padme. Does that reference ever help at the table?
That's interesting.
Jen?
I haven't had that experience of using it. In my particular case, that when I do mediation, it's typically small business mediation. Sometimes I worry about having legitimacy in these spaces. And so I lean more into kind of the law professor part of my personality and less into sort of the pop culture love. But that said, in teaching or at a conference or in mediation, if I feel like it would resonate and maybe make clear for somebody kind of what's going on, or it would be disarming in a way that would be helpful, I would not hesitate to reference Yoda or some other character that I think that they would easily understand. Or the battle of good versus evil, or whatever it is. Yeah. So it can be a way, I think, to capture a certain kind of idea. It just has to be very strategically deployed.
Absolutely. And it's sort of a piece of what we call social intuition, the ways that we, in these negotiation situations, that we find inroads to connect between us and the others. And through those inroads, give us the ability to affect them and for them to affect us. So the same question of do you use humor in these situations, or do you use a metaphor? And we know the power that they bring to the table, but we also know that it can backfire and what that does to communication. And so just as Jen said, if the parties, let's say that you're mediating between, have indicated that this is a vehicle that they get, that it resonates with them, then drive it, for all you're worth. Whether it's Star Wars or other cultural references, it's an opening. And we'd be wise to use those, particularly since formality can only take us so far. And we do need that human touch.
And lots of times people can't understand their own conflict because they're too close to it. So they can't understand the dynamics or their role or what they're contributing or how it's all working. And they can understand a metaphor or some other situation. In fact, this is sort of the theory our book is built on, is that if you want to make people more literate about conflict, you don't try to get them to introspect their own conflicts because they're not positioned to have any kind of way of understanding those that are not maybe more partisan or charged. And so you have them look at conflicts they already find fascinating. And we talk about how those work and apply some of that insight into conflicts you see or conflicts you experience. I do think, Melissa, it's very important that people do have thoughts like, well, I'm acting like an Anakin here. Well, I think that's really useful if you can map what you're doing to this thing that you saw him do. And then you know that when he did it, it didn't work out the way he had hoped,
Exactly. No one wants to realize that they're the Darth Sidious in this, equation.
And I think, Jen, we've probably seen it perhaps more in classes than we do in actual mediations. But once I, as the teacher, have indicated that this is one frame of reference that I'm very, very comfortable with, after your first or second reference in a course, then from that point on in the course, there will always be students who will make those comments of, she went all Anakin on me, or I found myself, asking what would Obi-Wan do, or whatever the reference is. And it's not even something we taught them. It wasn't part of the lesson. It wasn't part of the content, but they've already started plowing that back into their own reflections.
Do you find the students connecting themselves to these different personalities? Are there key personality types kind of in conflicts that then play into how do we negotiate a solution?
There is a typology in the conflict negotiation and psychological world that basically says people break down into 4 or 5 different personality types when it comes to conflict. As part of our personality, people tend to respond to conflict in one of 4 different modes. Some of us, by nature, anytime we're confronted with a conflict, we sort of tend to shrink and hopefully avoid the conflict. Sort of on the flip side of that, others of us are very competitive and try to just get everything we need or everything we can, or even just to beat the other person just for the sake of beating them. And it's not about thinking. This isn't strategic, as we spoke about before. This is our gut reaction. Other responses are accommodating the other, just giving in, and cooperating with the other, which means working together with the other in order to achieve both what we need and to help them achieve what they need. We have video here, so I could see you nodding at different points, and I can imagine all the listeners here at this point sort of nodding at different points. Oh, that sounds like me. And it's not as if we go down this path in every single conflict we are in, but we do have one of these that is our default. And in order to change our behavior, we need to make a certain effort, certain cognitive and conscious intention. If you ask, who might be a naturally competitive person in Star Wars, who do you think?
I think Han.
Yeah.
Yep.
I mean, Anakin certainly seems competitive to me.
Yeah, right. Everything is, if you're not with me, then you're my enemy.
Right.
And that's like before brushing his teeth in the morning. It's easy to label people in that way. Now, we won't always be right. And the good thing is that when you're talking about characters in Star Wars, it doesn't really matter whether you're right, whether Han is that or whether Anakin is that. What we really love is that people can argue over these things. And as we're arguing over these things, and Jen and I argue over these often, you're actually sharpening your understanding of both the character. So you're sharpening your Star Wars understanding, and you're also sharpening your understanding of what it means to have an internal conflict mode that's sort of your autopilot in so many situations.
And useful to remember that others have the same, that they might be reacting in a default way, and that it's not that you need to take that reaction personally necessarily. It might be useful just to be able to see it as one of the ways people react in conflict. They might be very relationship oriented, or they might be very winning oriented. And so in terms of talking to groups, it's one of the most accessible things that we've been able to provide in our book, that understanding of how people roughly fall into these categories. You could look at Star Wars, you could look at yourself, you can look at others.
Right, because when you say, okay, who accommodates, who just gives in Star Wars, it's sort of hard to think about someone, because Star Wars is all about, heroes fighting and always rushing forward and something. And then you think about C-3PO.
I know, that's what I was going to say.
Always looking for someone to surrender to. And actually, there are quite a few people who are either yielding by nature or who are accommodating by nature. Those people, they don't get as much screen time in Hollywood blockbusters as the competitive types do. But, half of us are that way. And we really need to get to know that and to recognize it in ourselves, recognize it in others, and work with that, because we're not stuck in always being that way all our lives. It's not our destiny that we
Right.
must, it's the only way. No, it just means that if you want to do something different, if you're a C-3PO, but you figure, no, now I want to fight, you're going to have to put an effort into saying, no, this is the moment to compete. And then you take your droid battle head, you stick it on your body, and you start, die, Jedi dogs.
Now, where does a sassy R2 fall in those categories?
What do you think?
Yeah, it's a good question. I just always want to be more like R2D2, so I figured.
I do love R2. I think he kind of hugs that line of cooperative and competitive. He wants to win that three-dimensional chess for sure.
Yeah, I know when you kind of talked about people that kind of just give in or the ones that back away, I immediately kind of thought of Jar Jar and when he surrenders and he's like, "I give up." When the battle droids surround him, that he's very quick to surrender, and you kind of look at his character overall, and you kind of see that he is just kind of willing to accept what comes to him. That he gets banished by the Gungans, and then he follows along with Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon, and basically is along for the ride without really pushing his own agenda and stuff. And then kind of later on in Coruscant, he talks to the queen a little bit and really starts to kind of assert his own idea of, he recognizes his own people are very proud and not going to go down without a fight. And then that kind of gives Padme her in of like, okay, we now have some backup power. But then later on, he gets played by the chancellor, like, if only Queen Amidala was here. And so he's like, oh, I better do what they think she would do and vote to give Palpatine more power.
Yeah, somewhere in there, is there also a pawn, sort of personality.
Yes, and it kind of links together this negotiations will not fail with the talk of knowing people's conflict styles and personalities. I think part of the reason Palpatine is so successful, until he isn't, but he's so successful, is that he reads people so well and he knows, how to manipulate them, and he knows what it is that they want or what they might respond to. And he's actually very emotionally literate. I mean, he's got a lot of evil genius in the background, but he's effective in a pretty spectacular way when it comes to thinking through relationships, through people's personalities, through what motivates folks. He pieces all that together to get what he wants.
Yeah, he knows what buttons to push on people.
Right.
Absolutely.
Right. And a lot of that knowledge on what buttons to put on people comes from the realms of negotiation and conflict. And it's really interesting that we always think about Jar Jar getting played in that spectacular moment. But when you think about it, the entire Jedi Order got played by Palpatine in exactly the same way. But it was just less, there wasn't the comic sort of character. But even if you think of that scene with Palpatine that we're talking about, my negotiations will not fail. So Mace Windu, doesn't buy that. Mace Windu isn't played as easily as many others. And so he says, yeah, but you got to remember, if they do fail, because negotiations often fail, we're protectors of the peace. We're not soldiers. We can't, defend the Republic. And then Palpatine turns to Yoda and he says, Master Yoda, do you really think it'll come to war? And asking him, and that all the time he knows that Yoda cannot really see clearly because of the Shroud of the Dark. He's just enjoying the moment. He's savoring that moment that he sees Yoda trying to hold the facade of, oh, no, everything's business as usual. So he was able to read everyone. Let me just go back to R2-D2. I think that R2-D2 is the second most competitive character in the entire series, second only to Anakin. He never did what anybody else told him to do. He never stayed with the ship. He just did what he thought he needed to do.
But I don't think that necessarily equates to a desire to win.
Yeah, it's more like digs in heels, sort of what I was thinking of, right? Where it's like double down type of thing rather than actually trying to win, just trying to, I do what I want. That's sort of more how I see R2.
It's a variant. So there's the competitive desire to win can actually be pretty destructive and can make people do a lot of things against their interests. R2 does have that competitive feeling of, I know what's the right move here, and that's what I'm going to do.
I like it. I'm going to try to channel some R2-D2. I'm doing some union negotiations currently. So maybe I'll channel my inner R2-D2 of careful, I'll zap you.
He never loses sight of the goal they're there to do. And partly because we can't understand him and partly because that's just his nature, he doesn't always stop to explain everything to everyone. right? He'll just knock C-3PO over the precipice in that droid foundry, right? And just, I don't have time to talk about this, but I remember what the goal is, and it's about that. It's not about winning, as Jen says. It's about achieving what we came here to do.
Right.
He's all logic. Sometimes that pushes over into the other people's boundaries of like, I know what's right. I'm going to push you off an edge. We think of that as just like cats throwing stuff off the edge, kind of just for fun. And maybe R2 thinks some of that is fun, but also it's like, this does achieve what we need to achieve. And sometimes that works for him. And, oftentimes it does.
I would say all of the time it works out for R2-D2. Well, what are some other good examples? I guess, what is each of your sort of favorite examples? Something that when you figured out how a Star Wars character or Star Wars scene really fit in with your expertise.
Well, it's hard to pick a favorite. There's so many things. And Noam and I did a different video at some point on Luke and Jabba negotiating and how that goes so terribly wrong, but then goes so wonderfully right, and all the different pieces of that. I think that one that comes to mind right away when you started talking was the Vexus scene in, I guess that was in The Rise of Skywalker.
Yeah.
And so Rey and Poe and Finn are all underground. C-3PO, I think, is there too. They encountered that Vexus. And I think about this one a lot recently, this encounter with somebody that you think might be an aggressor, or somebody who you think might not have your interests at heart. And so not knowing anything about them and not being able to communicate, we often jump to the worst possible conclusion about what their motives are, about what they're going to do. And you see that Poe and Finn immediately then want to attack. And it comes from not like from a bloodthirsty place. It comes from fear, which is so much of, what conflict ends up engendering in people. Even the conflict that's going to be negotiated is often accompanied by a lot of fear. I love that scene so much because they make those assumptions, and Rey has this other idea. She decides, before we go there, let's see if we can figure out what it wants. Of course, we know she does figure it out, that it has this interest, it has a wound, and she actually has something she can do for the Vexus. And then it has something it can do for them, which is lead them out of that cave. This particular theme pops up in Star Wars a lot. Another one of my favorite images is in Return of the Jedi, when that AT-ST comes up to the bunker and they think they're dead, right. And then Chewbacca pops out of the top of it. You didn't know, but your friend had done this. And so, if you would have assumed the worst and done those two logs at that point, you would have killed your friend, which would have been bad. And certainly, Luke taking his weapons into the cave, he assumes the worst. Yoda says, don't do that. And he does it anyway. And it's because he's thinking, I'm going to encounter my enemy. And so it's very telling when he encounters himself in there, because it's this lesson that I think Star Wars actually teaches us over and over, that you are hurting yourself by making some of these assumptions.
Actually, my own piggybacks off that, because immediately what came to mind is something that it's been with me since I first started learning conflict resolution in 1998. What a stunning moment in The Phantom Menace, where in the middle of the battle of the Duel of the Fates, where suddenly in the middle of the battle, Qui-Gon kneels down and starts meditating in the middle of conflict. I was just in that place. I was in law school. I was learning, I was learning to Darth Maul my way through the universe. And that notion that there is another way was so powerful. And one of the things that happens in conflict, Jen spoke about this with our fear and what that makes us think about the other and the situation. For fear and for other reasons, some of them psychological and some of them physiological, we really do often lose our minds is a strong word, but we lose our focus. We lose our ability to take all things into consideration in conflict. And we experience this sort of tunnel vision. And in that tunnel vision, if you're not with me, then you are my enemy, really makes sense in all sorts of ways. There's a chapter in this in our upcoming book that was written together by a husband-wife team. The wife is a mediator and the husband is a physician. And they wrote about the physiological stress response, what happens to us under stress, how that affects how we work in conflict, which is a stressful situation, how that affects our decision-making, our actions, our bodies, and how perhaps some Jedi training could help us to get better at that. And indeed, when you think about what Qui-Gon is doing, he's gaining his energy for what is not about to be a peaceful conversation, right? He's not going there to work it out. That would throw the music off wildly. But still that notion that even in the middle of conflict, whether your next move is going to be fierce competition or fierce cooperation, take the time to center yourself, to remember what you came here for, to gather from your sources of strength, whether the positive or negative mindset that you need in order to engage in that well, and then go forward to the next step in the conflict. So often in conflict, we can set up those ray shields and all you need to do is take a 5-minute break. and do some of that. Of course, Darth Maul is really doing the same thing on the other side of the ray shield, only his way to gain that energy is, through raging.
Pacing and the glowering and the...
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Brooding.
If that works for you, if that floats your land speeder, then, knock yourself out. But that moment of breathing, thinking clearly, the world is not going to come apart in the next 10 seconds. I can think about this, and I don't have to make these split-second reactions that don't come from the logical part of our brain, but come from a much more primal part of our brain that's used to, running away from lions. That was so powerful for me in conflict, and it continues to be such a helpful image that I take with me into every conflict that I'm in.
Do you ever find yourself on the other side of the ray shield and just raging during those moments instead?
When I do, I try to remember that that's not what gives me power. It's not easy necessarily to step away from it. I mean, this is really what Yoda said, that the dark side is more seductive. When you are in that raging, pacing back and forth mood and just thinking how to vanquish the other and tear them to shreds, it feels really good. And that's a really powerful battery to connect to. And sometimes detaching myself from it is really hard. It's not an anger management issue.
One place we see that in today's world, of course, is in social media when people flame out their rage, and it feels good to just rip somebody up in your one-sided post. But it often is a hollow kind of victory, and we all know that it degrades the overall conversation for people to be exaggeratedly responding in these really partisan formats. And so that's a great scene to have picked, Noam.
Well, it picked me.
I like that.
If nothing else, that whatever, a minute or so later, the guy who's raging out or whatever ends up in two pieces. So, there's the storyline there that's like, okay, this doesn't work out long term for him. Not that Qui-Gon makes it that much longer, or it doesn't make it. Yeah, no, you're right. I was like, nope, that doesn't work.
We've been talking about ourselves, our own responses and our own conflict styles, our own personality. Conflict is only partly about ourselves. Unless you're Luke Skywalker in the sequels, in which it's mainly his internal conflicts. And there's a couple of chapters about that as well. But there's always another party, or many other parties, but it's always about the other party. And so there's a whole realm of tools and layers and skills in negotiation and conflict resolution that are really other-oriented, that are focusing on the other and where they are and what they're thinking about and what their mindset is and what their emotional state is and what they need and how can we work with them through all of that, because that's probably the most productive way to work with them rather than focusing solely on self.
It's interesting because I was thinking as we were preparing for this about the really big ones, right? Like every scene in the Senate, talking about actual wars and negotiation or whatever. But when Jen mentioned, Luke and Jabba, that's just a relatively straightforward face-to-face, that also counts. And then I started thinking about C-3PO and like the Ewoks. Mm-hmm. And that one's at least really unbalanced, right? Like the Ewoks literally think C-3PO is a god. Negotiating when it's not on a level playing field like that has got to introduce some other issues. And Jedi mind tricks in general, obviously, also do. So there's a lot of uneven playing field, power dynamic stuff going on in Star Wars I hadn't really thought of.
That's definitely true. And the Jedi mind tricks are interesting because, everybody loves to see the Jedi mind trick and it's fun. But if you think about it, it's a really manipulative thing to do. It's kind of intrusive. See, of course, a very exaggerated versions then when Kylo Ren is ripping things out of people's minds. And, even the Obi-Wan Kenobi at Mos Eisley, even that may be sort of harmless, but still, it's definitely qualifies as what we would call a hardball tactic. There's risks to using hardball tactics like that in negotiations. Certainly in the prequels, we see that the Jedi have developed a reputation for not being very trustworthy. People are hip to these Jedi mind tricks and they know that they're used sometimes. And so that may really have changed the way the Jedi were able to operate as neutral or honest brokers in these various political conflicts because, everybody always has to be on their guard that the Jedi might, do this underhanded mind trick. Even if it's well-intentioned, it's still manipulative.
Well, and it's clearly built into the droids too, right? C-3PO says, like, I'm programmed not to impersonate a deity. So that means, to me at least, that means that it had to be, right? Someone did it, so they had to program it into the next edition or whatever.
Yeah, I can't translate that Sith language.
Right, also.
Right. So again, in our books, there are a couple of chapters that really focus on this issue of how the Jedi, particularly in the prequels, how the Jedi engage with others. And if you look throughout the prequels, they engage with lightsabers and Jedi mind tricks far more than they engage with persuasion and empathy and explanations and For all that they're keepers of the peace, they're not really very skillful at the methods through which we, at least in this galaxy, either work as keepers of the peace, sort of in the UN peacekeepers mode, or in peacemakers in the sense of the profession of working things out, such as mediation or negotiation. They're simply not very skilled at that. They might try, they make one overture for asking for what they want, but if they don't get it, boom, boom, out with the lightsabers or with the Jedi mind trick. One of the points we make in the book is the Jedi could have used some of this. People often say, well, I want to be as wise a negotiator as Yoda. No. That's a very low bar. We need to be much better negotiations than the Jedi ever were.
Yeah, I think maybe having that force advantage kind of leaves them without as much skill because they're like, oh, I can call on the force. But we do see at the very beginning of Phantom Menace that, the Chancellor sends the Jedi to negotiate a treaty between the Naboo and the Trade Federation. So obviously they have some skill there. And maybe it's because they're seen as a neutral third party, whereas later on they are one of the parties to the conflict, and they're looking out after themselves. But of course, the whole thing falls apart because the Trade Federation is like, oh, we're not going to negotiate. We're going to try and kill them. And you mentioned the Rogue One coming to the table, all the different rebel leaders. But kind of what happens, when your antagonist, the Empire has a Death Star, that they have the nuclear option. How do you negotiate with somebody who simply can annihilate you?
It raises a bunch of different thoughts because, that's a dramatic example, but lots of people might feel this way in their real life negotiations with their boss, for example. You might think that person has all the power. I have no power. So I have to do everything that person says. And there's really nothing I can do. A lot of that is often imagined. It's not that you imagine that there's a structural difference in power or that one side might have a Death Star and one side does not. It's that the idea that power confers then an absolute control over the situation. In some ways, the belief that is true is what makes it true. And so one of the great things about Star Wars is its emphasis on rebellion, insurrection, people sort of rising up, people kind of like coming together, people being discontented, the Andor, et cetera. They're all examples of this same dynamic of whenever there's this like super powerful entity, there are these ways that groups start to ally themselves or capitalize on their own leverage or whatever it is to rise up against that entity. And in the case of the Death Star, one of the great points of Rogue One is that they treated Galen Erso as though he had no choice but to help them. Because they had all the power, he had none of the power. They're willing to kill his whole family and force him into working for them. And so he does so, but then he, of course, programs the weakness into the Death Star. So in some ways, it's that exercise of power that both ends up being its own undoing when it's so lopsided like that. The lopsidedness can sometimes lead to an assumption that is not true, or it can lead to an overconfidence that ends up being unwarranted.
Right. What Andor is about is that if you just question the overwhelming nature of the other side's power, then A, you've achieved power of your own, and B, you start to freak the superpower up. And if you do that enough, then you're going to shake something really loose on both ends. So that's every bit of every episode, and part of Nemec's manifestos is about how to do that and how that works. I wish they had given him more time to write that manifesto.
Yeah, definitely. I'm curious now that I'm thinking about it, is there even an example of good conflict resolution in all of Star Wars? Like, if the Jedi aren't it, which they're clearly not, they have a lot of failures. Is there even a good example? I'm trying to picture like episode 1, if those negotiations had gone well, just like roll credits after 20 minutes, no episodes 2 through 9, like it's over.
Oh, Vader's very good at resolving conflicts. He's like, oh, you screwed up. I choke you. Well, conflict is over.
Effective versus good, I guess, maybe is a difference.
Constructive is sometimes a word.
So a very simple example might be the passage to Alderaan. They have this sort of meeting of people. They have different interests. They don't have enough money to pay. So they come up with this creative solution that we're going to pay you 2 now and 15 then when we get there. And that ends up being acceptable because, Han needs the money. So I think that we have little examples like that. We have, the Vexus example from before of more enlightened conflict resolution. We have a lot of good conflict advice that comes up in various moments. For example, Ghost Yoda coming to Luke in The Last Jedi and telling him about the importance of failure and helping Luke sort of resolve some internal conflicts. There's a number of internal conflict resolutions that I think are good examples. And of course, one of the big ones, Darth Vader coming around. This transformation, you could think of it in terms of internal conflict, or you could think of it as a skillful deployment of conflict resolution skills by Luke to convince Darth Vader to come back. He enters that second Death Star with a plan, and he's very clear on what it is he wants, and he really knows how to say the words, do the things that speak to Vader's deeper interests in having and being back with the light and his son.
There are a lot of negative examples, which as teachers, that's fine, or as authors, that's fine. Negative examples, the greatest teacher failure is. We're covered. Once Yoda said that, we kicked open the door. So in the movies, one major success is the treaty between the Gungan and the Naboo. And that's particularly helpful because there are two negotiations that we see in that regard, one of them unsuccessful and one of them successful. There's a chapter in the new book on the successful one. But when you think back on that whole story, so there was when Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon first landed on Naboo, they tried to persuade the Gungans to team up with the Naboo. And they were sort of playing a bit of unsolicited, what we call shuttle diplomacy, which is sort of running to one party and speaking with them, and then perhaps conveying a message back and running to another party and running back and forth between them, either because technically you can't get them in the same room, or because they don't know that they exist, or because they hate each other so bad that they don't want to be in the same space. So there's a mediative role in that. And they got shut down repeatedly. They tried in different ways. Qui-Gon tried in his way, and then Obi-Wan in a very cerebral way says you form a symbiotic relationship. What happens to one will happen to the other. And, Boss Nash wasn't having any of that. And then later you have Padme orchestrating the meeting in the swamp and the revelation of Padme and Amidala and who's who, and that vulnerability she accepted and how she built trust with them. So that's a big picture, really successful. There are other smaller scale successes. There are successes on a smaller scale. And one that came to mind when you asked was in The Mandalorian. I think it's in the episode The Marshal. He wants to get his armor back. Cobb Vanth doesn't want to give it to him back. And they're about to shoot each other, but then a greater danger plows its way through the town, and it makes them rethink again. It makes Cobb Vanth say, a second ago we were going to do this in front of the kid, and now let's talk. And what they talk about is, will you kill the Krayt Dragon for us, alleviate this great danger to the town, and I'll take on the risk of defending the town without the armor from now, and you can keep it. So that's just one scene. But what then happens throughout the rest of the episode is what happens when they meet the Sand People. And the Sand People are, the natural enemies of the Mos Pelgo settlers. And Mando mediates between them. There's even that moment where he manages to get them together. Neither of them really believe that it's going to work, but they sit and they converse. And then at some point they start arguing again. And he physically separates between them with a blowtorch. And then he gets them to sit down again. You see these scenes where there are flare-ups between the Sand People and the Mos Pelgo people. And then it's Cobb Vanth who goes and resolves the disputes because he's learned how to do that. He's seen a model of how to do it. And so he goes and he applies it, and peace breaks out once again. There was another person watching that scene, which was Grogu, who also saw that blowtorch scene. And if you remember that at the end of The Mandalorian, he also did the same thing when he separated between the two Mandalorians who were going at each other with knives. Mm-hmm. And he was in that robot body, and he said, no, holding them apart, because he had seen Mando do it. And so there's a lot to talk about here, how we learn conflict resolution skills as we go through life, how children learn from their parents how to react to conflict. And sometimes it's really successful. Sometimes you need to use aggressive negotiation moves just in order to get the other party to talk with you. And perhaps then you can use the more cooperative moves. And in this, think about Darth Vader holding his lightsaber to Luke's throat. And then instead of killing him, to say, okay, we could go this way, or you could join me and together we'll rule the galaxy as Father is. And often in our real life negotiations, sometimes it could sound horrible or sound offensive, but sometimes we need to twist the other person's arm into cooperating with us. It's just a fact of relationships.
Well, it's very situation specific, very person specific. Not everybody's going to be able to generate the level of aggressiveness that somebody else might. And it's a bad idea to do something really inauthentic or unnatural in negotiation. It's hard to pull it off. This is where some of that self-knowledge comes in. But as a general rule, I think it's true that you need to be able to pivot as you can to different kinds of approaches because you've strategically decided this is what this situation needs. And if for some reason you can't bring the level of aggression or whatever it is, this is where you start thinking about, are there other people I can bring into this situation? Are there allies that might be useful here? What other kinds of structures could I put together to basically be the equivalent of twisting an arm?
Bring the Wookiee with you. That's
That's
what
right.
you're doing. It's like, I need a Wookiee.
But the Wookiee is a great example of that. Remember Han Solo and Chewbacca meeting for the first time in Solo, right? And they both think they have some degree of power, so they start fighting. And then Han suddenly realizes, wait, I am not going to win this. I'm being held upside down or being shoved down into the mud by a Wookiee who is clearly stronger than me and hungrier than me. And this is not going to end well. And so he pivots towards a cooperative approach and tries to bring Chewbacca along into that cooperative approach. So it's sort of the opposite. He's not able to twist Chewbacca's arm into cooperating with him. He has to use other tools in order to bring him in.
I had a quick thought. We talk about conflict resolution, but there's also kind of conflict mitigation that you kind of see that when Leia first meets Wicket, and it could be a hostile encounter, and she immediately kind of does things to try and befriend him that very diplomatic and reaching out. And then of course, that works out well. Or when, Rey and the Vexus, again, she reaches out, she makes herself vulnerable, but it ends up you gain a favor that way. Are there tips for that? Those are two examples, but how does that work in real life?
I'm glad you raised this because I was going to say this before we were talking about the Jedi and how maybe their command of the Force actually made them weaker in these various political situations in the prequels, especially. I also think that, and this goes to what you just said about Rey and about Leia, their decision to not have attachments and their sort of deprioritizing of relationships was maybe another reason why they were not able to see what was going to happen, why they were clouded with the Force and why they didn't necessarily do, a very successful job, as Noam's just said, with the Gungans, not thinking about other people as people and not valuing the building of relationships. And of course, the Jedi, in fact, say don't form attachments. I think those two examples are really good examples of how just making friends or, just forming connections can often prevent conflict or mitigate it or make it so much more manageable if it does arise, because there's sort of this common ground. It's very much common sense, but we forget about it, especially as we get older and we're in like difficult situations at work or whatever it is. We forget about the fact that building that goodwill with others and paying attention to those relationships really makes a difference.
Including managing bad relationships or hard relationships wisely. Let me take another starting point. Something I came up with myself is your perspective determines your reality. Just thinking about the name of this podcast, right? The ologies. Where's our ology? Our field isn't an ology. It's called conflict resolution. That determines our reality. It determines what we look at. In some places, and particularly it's more common in Europe, that this field is called conflictology. Conflictology is the study of conflict without the sort of bias towards conflict is a bad thing. Or even if we say it's sometimes good, what we really want to do is get rid of it. But it's more of a study of what is the nature of conflict? What does it tend to do? And sure, how do we deal with it? But also, how do we anticipate it? How can we prevent it? How can we mitigate it? But also perhaps other things. And one of those other things, how do we conduct it better while not being any less fierce or any less adversarial, but still keeping in mind that there's more at stake than the right here and now of who swings a lightsaber quickly.
And both of those examples that James brought up, this is certainly too big a can of worms to open as we try to wrap up. But like I wrote about the Leia one, befriending Wicket versus however many minutes later in the movie, Han negotiating with the Ewoks too, and nearly getting everybody eaten. It's like these approaches make a really big difference. And so it's the same with Rey, as you point out, versus what Poe was going to do. And, you actually get to your goal and everybody is rescued. And like literally the galaxy is rescued because, Rey and Leia were in charge instead of Poe and Han Solo. I don't know if there's certainly gender dynamics there of the screenwriters of, in real life, all those sorts of things. Like I said, way too big a can of worms, but those scenes were excellent examples, James.
Well, there's one word that I don't know if we've said it all through this, and I'm not going to open this can of worms, but I'm going to plant it there for listeners if anyone wants to consider that both Leia and Rey have a superpower of empathy.
Right.
And other characters in the series don't necessarily have it. And look at the power of that.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's start our wrap up process, even though obviously there's a lot more to discuss here. We'll have to do a convention panel all together or something like that. Maybe like mock negotiations or something like that. But tell us each about your favorite Star Wars character. We'll start with you, Jen.
I've chosen Chewbacca. He's my favorite. And I love Chewbacca because I think he is inclined toward patience. He's inclined toward peace, but he's not a doormat, which is kind of funny since he gets called a big walking carpet. I think he's very peace loving, and I find him to be strong and principled and brave, but not aggressive and not violent. So that's a great combination to have when you are dealing with many types of conflict.
Good choice.
Okay, you've persuaded me. So I've discovered that it changes over the years. As a kid, I was very drawn to both Han Solo for one side and to Luke for another side. And it was only like in my 20s that I suddenly realized, whoa, like you had Leia Organa there as a role model this whole time. And you just, went with the boys with the blasters. But over the past few years, it's been Ahsoka. She's probably the best developed character in all of Star Wars. Think of all the screen time we get with her and all the challenges and travails she went through and the questions she faced. And we always got insight into what was on her mind. So there's a lot to work with. And I think what speaks to me with her, both personally and in conflict, is that she knows herself. She knows her place. And yet she's always questioned. She doesn't stay in the same place. She doesn't stand still. She learns from her masters, and yet she always questions them. She accepts their wisdom and their place in the hierarchy, but she still trusts herself and knows when something is off, even if the hierarchy is structured to tell her that it's right. And she trusts herself so much that she walks away. When she knows it's wrong, she walks away. She walked away and she continued fighting that same fight, connecting to the same ideals and seeking the same outcome as she used to as a Jedi, only this time on the outside, knowing that she doesn't belong anymore. She has to make her own moral decisions and trusting herself to do that.
So if somebody was interested in going into the field of conflict resolution, how would you recommend them going about that?
Well, there's a number of different approaches. People can always go to law school, which is the approach I particularly love. Law school is all about dispute resolution, actually, and about making deals. So it's very much for people who are interested in how things are ordered and figuring out how to come to resolutions. There's a big, strong tradition of alternative dispute resolution within law schools for people who are interested in negotiation, mediation, arbitration, and all the different non-litigation forms of resolving conflict. That is definitely one of the well-traveled paths that Noam and I both traveled. Some people don't go to law school, but they do pursue undergraduate and graduate studies in conflict-related fields, peace studies, conflict resolution, I guess conflictology. And there's always options to do mediation. Many communities have community mediation centers that people can get training at and then mediate neighbor disputes and other small disputes in the area.
If those are the sort of most easily sort of accessible, some of them are quite costly, but well-traveled paths, sort of looking at this from the other end is that we're all in the business of conflict resolution. All our lives, we're in the business of conflict resolution. And one way to get better at it doesn't necessarily mean you go back to school, but it really means that you take small incremental steps on your own. And that one of those could be reading a book. And it doesn't have to be our book, right? But you read a book that's about conflict and you realize, so this is why I respond to conflict in this way or that way in my life. These are decisions that I can make. The step from there to saying, okay, so if I've learned that to myself, how can I use this to affect my environment? How can I use this to help my friends with their issues? All the times that friends come to you with a question or a challenge or just tell you about their day, and so much of what they tell you is conflict, what do you say to them? And if even a bit of what you say to them is actually grounded, scientific, or sort of things you've learned through practice and reflection, or others have learned through practice and reflection, you can make a big difference starting from the circle right around yourself.
That's such a good point. I'm glad that you shared that. You don't have to go get a law degree, but we could all use a little bit of sort of fact-based conflict resolution education.
It's like the Force. So yeah, you can go the whole route and become a Jedi Master and be on the council, and okay. Or you can be Broom Boy, right? Either way.
Right. Just make life a little bit easier. I like that. That's great. Well, tell us again the titles of both your books, and we'll make sure we include links in our show notes. And then anywhere else that we can find you on social media or online publications or anything like that.
So the name of our book that is already out is Star Wars and Conflict Resolution, Our Alternatives to Fighting. You can follow us on starwarsandconflictresolution.com. And we have another book coming out soon, episode 2, we call it informally, Star Wars and Conflict Resolution. My negotiations will not fail, as we said. We're active on Twitter. We're active on Instagram, on Facebook, at Star Wars Conres. And we love when people engage with us. And anybody who wants to nerd out about anything related to conflict in Star Wars, we're here.
Awesome. Well, this was great. I feel a little bit more prepared for my own union negotiations that I'm part of. Think of what would Qui-Gon do, maybe.
Or maybe what would Maz Kanata do?
That's true. I like that. Well, thanks very much. I appreciate you coming and sharing your expertise.
And thank you all for all you listeners out there. Thank you. And James, Melissa, I love your podcast. I'm so
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, thank you both so much. This has been so fun, and thanks for the work you're doing in this space. It's great.
Well, the negotiations were short, and so it is time to wrap up this episode of Star Warsologies. We want to thank our guests, Noam Ebner and Jen Reynolds, and we want to thank all of you for listening.
Yes, and if you're looking for the links to their books and the other things we talked about, check out our show notes page, which is at skywalkingthroughneverland.com/star-warsologies. And also check out our Star Warsologies YouTube channel, where we will post some episodes with related visuals, including all of our convention panels.
If you have an idea for a topic for Star Warsologies or know an expert we should interview, let us know at Star Warsologies on Twitter and Instagram, or at starwarsologies@gmail.com. We also have a fan group on Facebook. It is the Star Warsologies podcast fan group. So join today, chat with us and your fellow listeners.
Yes, we'll definitely post some of those can of worm questions we got to at the end of this episode for some discussion there. And please also rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast on your favorite service and share it with your friends.
No topic is off limits, even why the aquatic Mon Calamari have feet that fit in human shoes.
We are part of the Skywalking Network, where you can find a variety of other great shows about Star Wars, Disney, and Marvel, including the Max FX podcast, Neverland Clubhouse, and the flagship show Skywalking Through Neverland. They also have a YouTube show and books called Today in Star Wars History. You can find all of that at skywalkingnetwork.com.
See you next time on Star Warsologies.